At first glance, the characters from the heroic legend of Arslan seem to fit into classic MMORPG or fantasy molds. The idealistic leader, the genius tactician, the overpowered tank, the bard, the archer, and the scout. Yet when you take a closer look at any of these characters, you see that they go well beyond that mold, and have a sort of well-rounded ability set that makes them feel far more realistic, and far more three-dimensional than your average stereotype trope. For instance, Ferungi's is the archer, but she can't just serve as an archer. She's also got spiritual abilities, and even though that's typically something that goes together, she's also highly talented at knife fighting. Also, Ferungi's isn't the only archer. Give's very introduction is based on his skill with the bow, and he's not the only one, as Daryun, Arslan, and Alim are also all shown to be proficient archers. The overpowered tank role is basically that of a character with incredible skill with one or sometimes more than one weapon, and can charge down their opponents like so many NPCs. This is a warrior who is always on the front lines of every battlefield, and this is a warrior also who tends to charge in first and ask questions later. These sorts of characters tend to be portrayed with not a lot of intelligence, but rather with this sort of bullheaded stubbornness that puts them into every fight. However, Daryun is also an archer, meaning that he sometimes takes on the archer's secondary or supporting role as well as the role of main frontline fighter. Additionally, Daryun is far from unintelligent. He's shown to be quite clever and a strategist in his own right. In fact, the entire reason that Kharlan set him up to quarrel with King Andragoras III before the Battle of Atropatene was that Kharlan knew Daryun's intelligence as a commander, and that Daryun was the most likely of all the Lords Mars-Ban to get suspicious and maybe even to see through his treachery. And Kharlan could not, under any circumstances, afford for Daryun to be in command of men at that time. Nor are we simply told of Daryun's intelligence. We see his intelligence firsthand, when he manipulates Narcissus into getting involved with the conflict with the Lusitanians by setting him up for a visit from Kharlan's men. Additionally, Daryun is not the only member of the party skilled with the sword. Give, Alim, Arslan, Narcissus, and eventually Alfred and Jaswant, when they join, are all also talented with the blade. Narcissus may be a brilliant strategist, but that's not his only role either. Most strategist characters are weak and tend to need protection from the other forces, but Narcissus doesn't. He is, as I've said, a fighter in his own right with a sword, and he also has some other talents. He's amazing art, for one. Additionally, Narcissus isn't the only strategist of the group. Give is also an incredibly clever strategist, and Daryun, as I've mentioned, is also one. Even Arslan himself has some talent as a strategist and as an understander of man's minds. In fact, all of the characters are intelligent, even if they're not necessarily strategists. And the intelligence of all these characters helps to raise Arslan to its level of greatness as a story because of its intelligence and its lack of stupidity, both among the cast and in the plotting. Then, of course, there's Arslan himself. Arslan is, of course, this young and untried leader with a good heart, but he's got a lot more going for him than that. For one thing, he's a capable fighter. His archery is pretty good, and as for his sword skill, it's kind of weak to begin with, but he really works on it and builds it throughout the course of the series, and it's this evolution of skill rather than starting with skill that adds to the idea that he is an evolving character. But Arslan also has two other things that the other characters of his ilk do not, and they are intelligence and charisma. Arslan is an incredibly shrewd judge of men's character. He sees through most of the enemies before they reveal themselves to be such, well, with the exception of Kharlan. And as for his friends, he sees straight through Give and his pretended loyalty, seeing that Give's love of money far outweighs his loyalty to Arslan. Yet the thing with Arslan is that he earns his companions. True, Ferungi's and Daryun were pretty much going to be loyal to him no matter what, but that's not true of the rest of them, and even Daryun says, time and time again, that where he was once loyal to Arslan for the sake of his uncle, he's now loyal to Arslan for Arslan's own sake. And what's more, that loyalty doesn't just come from Nowheresville. You see, each and every time, something changes that makes one of Arslan's companions truly loyal to him. From his rescue of Alim, even though Alim's nothing more than a squire and Arslan's a prince, an act which secures him Give's loyalty, as well as Alim's, to when he figures out exactly the right thing to say to Narcissus and the right thing to offer him in order to get Narcissus to join him in Daryun. While Alim does do some of the scattered around, he's also got other abilities. Like I said, he's a sword fighter and an archer. He's also really good with the sling. While Give also knows a lot more than just how to pluck his lyre. He's also, as I've said, an archer, a swordsman, and a clever and cunning fox of a tactician. All in all, the well-rounded practicality of all of the characters means that the characters must differentiate themselves other than by type and ability. For example, the Lords Marsban are all cunning, clever strategists who wield swords and fight at the front of the battle. They're all incredibly overpowered, and they're all good with their weapons. So the way to differentiate them was to give them different personalities. We don't get to know many of them, but of the ones we do know, they're all quite different. Lord Marsban Shapur is very upright in his duties. He's incredibly loyal to the point of blind obedience. He obeys and follows the king's commands regardless of the sense behind them. He also believes in his righteousness and in the justice he's bringing. This puts him in direct conflict with Kubard, who is a bit of a drunkard and is not so fond of the royal family, or royalty in general. He serves the king and would follow him anywhere, except if the king doesn't live up to his standards. He's a lot more shrewd about it and a lot less blind to his loyalty, yet he still loves to fight and will genuinely serve one who he thinks is worthy. Probably the one most similar to Kubard is actually the traitorous Lord Karlan. Karlan also sees himself as a loyal servant of the Parsian homeland, yet at the same time does not adhere to any one particular ruler, but rather to the royal house as a whole. So that when he learns of the treacherous way in which King Andragoras III killed his brother Osroes and attempted to kill his nephew Helmes, Karlan decides that Andragoras is no longer fit to receive his service or to rule, and decides to do something about that. However, to Karlan, what matters in a ruler is not so much the fitness, which is what Kubard was judging, but rather the legitimacy. And as he sees that Helmes is the more legitimate ruler, he decides to back Helmes, even if it means turning against his country, being hailed as a traitor, and even helping to let the Lusitanians overrun his beloved Pars. Som is also one to question the integrity of the royal family and its right to rule, but unlike Kubard and Karlan, he tends to look more at the big picture than at any one specific ruler or action. For example, when Ecbatana was going to fall, he was the only one who saw that hurting the slaves that the Lusitanians were trying to have open the gates was about the worst thing he could possibly do, because that would just incite more slaves to riot and would truly result in Ecbatanan's fall. He also saw through Tahamine and noticed how, even in the midst of the fear, she really didn't seem to care at all about Prince Arslan, not even asking if he was alive or not. Yet, although Sam starts out as an intelligent observer, he gets trapped in Silver Mask's webs and turns into nothing more than a mindlessly obedient follower devoted to Helmes and to his plans. Kishward's style of loyalty puts him in the same class as Shapur, as his mindless obedience to the royal family seems to be his dominating factor in his dealings with them, especially after Andragoras returns. Yet at the same time, he's a lot more lighthearted and laid back, and it's his laid-back manner that allows him to be a better judge of character than many of the other Lords Marsban. He's better at seeing through people and understanding their internal motives, and after this, it's hard for him to stay loyal to Andragoras when his heart so clearly is pointing him toward Arslan. Yet at the same time, his innate loyalty battles this love of Arslan, creating quite the internal conflict for him. And of course, speaking of loyalty to Arslan, how can we not talk about the Mardan fu Mardan, the greatest of the Lords Marsban, Daryun himself? Well, one thing I have to point out about Daryun is that his very overpoweredness should make him a boring or less good character, but it doesn't, and that has a lot to do with the way he's written and the skill of the writing. For one thing, the show knows that Daryun is going to cut his way through all the NPCs like they're just so much butter, and so the show lets you be okay with that. It doesn't try to pretend there's any tension there, because there's really no tension, and wasting its time trying to produce tension would just irritate the audience. For another thing, the way they use his fighting abilities is to create more tension at the times when you think he might actually lose, because, oh my god, even Daryun's having trouble with this guy, is a pretty scary thought. There are only really 2 fight scenes so far that have you thinking this. One happened during Cinder's battle before the gods, and this one was interesting because what saved Daryun at the end was not his overpowering strength, but rather his intelligence and his ingenuity. The second time was in his battle against Silver Mask at the end of Season 1, at which time you remembered one thing and one thing only. Daryun is not the most OP character in the show. He is the second most OP character in the show. Silver Mask is even more overpowered than Daryun, if that's possible, meaning that their battle was both incredibly epic and also incredibly frightening because you knew that Daryun actually was going to lose this one. And honestly, at the time, I was legitimately worried that he'd get killed off. The other great way that the series handles Daryun's overpowering strength is that they make it a comic thing. The entire cast knows how powerful Daryun is. Heck, the entire country knows how powerful Daryun is. There's this one great battle with the pirates in Season 2, where the battle's just started, but they want to speed things up because one of the ships are on fire. So Give's just like, hey, pirates, you know who this is? This is Daryun. And the pirates are like, what? No, not Daryun. And literally jump overboard, all of them, and start swimming as fast as they can, rather than fighting Daryun. It's, like, really great. And the fact that the show is both willing to admit that Daryun's incredibly overpowered, and also willing to not take itself too seriously so that it can have fun and enjoyable scenes like that, is, again, proof of smart writing. But speaking of Daryun and smart writing, I think, speaking of the Lords Marsmon also, there's another thing that makes the characters so well done, and this is also because of good writing. Basically, the show does not confuse skills or abilities with actual character and personality. Just because a character has a character trait like strong, flexible, good with a sword, clever, cunning, etc., that isn't a personality, and the show doesn't treat them like that. So back to Daryun. Daryun, aside from being this overpoweredly powerful Mardan fu Mardan, is a relatively laid-back and relaxed sort of character with a bit of a sarcastic streak when it comes to dealing with Narcissus. He cares deeply for his uncle, and the only thing that really seems to get him worked up is Arslan, because for someone who's as relaxed as he is, Daryun is seriously overprotective. Give is a sarcastic womanizer with a real hatred for government. He specifically loathes the sort of government that looks down on its people and treats them like nothing but so much chaff to the wind. He also hates nobility with a passion, and especially the royalty they serve. However, he also has quite the mercenary streak and has no problem profiting off both the nobility that he loathes and the carnage they cause. Elam is driven by his deep and abiding loyalty to Narcissus. Elam's parents were slaves until Narcissus freed them, and ever since then, Elam has faithfully served Narcissus in thanks. Yet Elam is not simply defined by his loyalty, but is also the voice of common sense within the group, tends to be the voice of reason at hectic moments. Narcissus is a snarky and sarcastic painter with a wry sense of humor, a love of teasing, specifically teasing Daryun, and an incredibly high set of moral standards. Like Give, Narcissus also tends to be anti-nobility, but unlike Give, this is because no monarch that Narcissus has ever come across meets his exacting moral standards. You know, things like no slavery and all men are equal and stuff like that. Then there's Arslan himself. Arslan is an incredibly kind and caring person, and I've already talked a bit about his charisma and his intelligence, but beneath all of the prince stuff and all of the royalty and all of the expectations placed on him, he's a 14-year-old kid who hasn't had a friend for so long. One of the things Arslan clearly wants most in the world is a friend his own age, just to talk to and laugh with. And his repeated attempts to become friends with Elam really show how this yearning need and this sort of innate childhood go far and beyond his persona as prince. Additionally, Arslan is constantly wrestling with the persona because having all these expectations placed on him, especially when his parents were in no way supportive, made it hard for him to believe he could ever live up to what he wants to achieve. And his struggle with that, again, helps him to evolve as a character. Out of the main group, the only one so far with not much of a personality, heck, the only character in the show so far without much of personality is Brangis. But as there's much more story to go, I'm really hoping this will change before too long. Now, I haven't even started to talk about two of my other favorite characters, Etoile and Helmes, aka Silver Mask, but I'm out of time, so please like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video. This is Coriander Stone, and I thank you for watching.